So hello everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the third cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I am very glad and honored to meet and present Tracey Eve Winton. Tracey Eve Winton is a scholar of architectural history, an artist, and a professor at the School of Architecture, University of Waterloo. She holds a PhD in the history and philosophy of architecture, produced 11 works of experimental theater, and taught in Rome and Italy over a decade. She specializes in iconography, architectural narrative, and cultural history. Current research for a book project investigates the language of modern architecture with a focus on the work of Carlo Scarpa and Bruno Zevi. Tracey, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a great pleasure to be here. Just going to share the presentation. So rather unoriginally, I've titled this The Corporeal Encounter with Architecture, Castle Vecchio Museum by Carlo Scarpa. And sorry, my slide didn't advance, but now it is. So today I want to share with you a famous work of architecture in Verona in Italy, whose design process is very rich, and I've been studying it for some years. I first discovered it, and then sort of grew the interest by taking my students to visit it every year, and then wanted to decode it further. So the architect was Carlo Scarpa, and today we'll take a glimpse into how he used artistic strategies in his work. He was very engaged in experimenting with the modern language of architecture and with storytelling using spatial narrative, something a bit deeper than Le Corbusier's architectural promenade, which is something you all might be familiar with. The Castle Vecchio Museum is an adaptive reuse project. It's famous for its ethereal atmosphere. Scarpa was known for his sense of craft and materiality, how he juxtaposed and layered older building fabric with new elements, as well as his handling of natural light. So I'm interested in how we can learn from Scarpa's methodology, not to imitate his style, but more how he achieves this ephemeral atmosphere that people all pick up on. And since I produced experimental theater for some years, I noticed his ability to stage scenes, because dramatization can make the invisible become visible and palpable. I spent a lot of time what I call thinking on site, which is mostly roaming around, but I also imagined while Scarpa worked there over so many years, what regional or contemporary influences he tapped into. So I'm kind of trying to trace his methodology. This map shows the site where, in the 14th century, while his family expanded Verona's city walls, the warlord Can Grande della Scala built a fortified castle with a private bridge. The medieval castle was designed by an architect named Guglielmo Bevilacqua, whose surname means drink the water, while the name Can Grande means big dog. And here you can actually see the big dog on his helmet that he wore. In 1517, Verona again extended its defensive walls, and workmen digging the new foundations discovered fossil fish deep underground, rousing theological debates about what they meant and how they came to be there. A Verona physician, Girolamo Fracastoro, reasoned that Noah's flood couldn't have left fish underground, so he proposed that their region's mountains must have originally formed on the sea floor, so rising and falling in geological cycles and indicating the Earth's ancient past. So this is really kind of a watershed moment. The doctor's student, apothecary Francesco Calzolari, collected these fossils, and above his pharmacy in central Verona, he founded the first scientific museum on record, with the idea to obtain knowledge directly through objects. This is really interesting. So Castle Vecchio lies about 600 meters from that first museum. It's a microcosm of Verona's urban history. And over time, I mean, it's got a very long history, but over time they used it as a prison, an academy, a barracks, a tribunal, an arsenal, a storehouse, and a military college. In 1923, Verona restored Castle Vecchio as a city museum, but during the war, Mussolini held a tribunal there, and then first the Allies bombed the site, and then as the Germans withdrew, they bombed the bridge, leaving a lot of the site in ruins. So today it consists of late Roman medieval ruins, the rebuilt bridge and arch, fortifications, French buildings, Venetian and fascist interventions, and the debris of a tiny 8th century church. In the 1950s, the museum director, who was an expert on theater architecture, hired Carlo Scarpa to adapt the site into a museum to showcase regional arts, a project of the next 2 decades. The architect of the earlier museum of 1923, Ferdinando Forlati, had decorated the buildings with antiques like a kind of fairy tale castle, and he inset the French facade with these salvaged Gothic windows from elsewhere. And Scarpa, when he was brought onto the project, he saw these choices as being arbitrary, fake, not related to the site, and this problem made him ask what might be an appropriate modern way to deal with the site's history. And finally, as I'll show, he found a path through poetics, so drawing on the arts and scenography to make memory the creative interpretive faculty it was in the Middle Ages. In the end, he didn't remove the Gothic windows, so it seems that he began to see the facade as a site of inscription over time. So a rich material substrate that registered actions and processes as he also peeled away or superimposed layers, showing how events left traces. The courtyard, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about today, the courtyard through which the visitors enter Castle Vecchio is an epic plain sprinkled with fragments and intrusions. Large architectural remnants lie strewn across the ground like an arte povera installation. The ground has many levels. It is not abstract. Ground is not a stable datum, but it has dips and slopes and descents into the underworld. The old church he didn't restore, but he left the foundations crude, open depressions in the earth with loose stones, with nature reclaiming blocks of stone. And this zone shows how ruins, fragments, and non finito evoke historical agency and mechanisms of natural processes like decomposition and erosion. In the decay of the finished surface, ruin allows us to look underneath surface planes and outlines, deep inside material itself, to explore the mystery of embodiment. Scarpa doesn't frame this as a romantic sublime or nostalgia for the past, but with the idea of unearthing truths. So Scarpa rendered this new entry sequence for visitors over a printed plan. This is one drawing out of the many, many drawings that he did for the project, but the site plan is really good. So to unite all these architectural fragments and museum artifacts, all from different eras, into a coherent present experience, he introduced narrative as a design strategy and configured an episodic path that continues through the site like a journey, building organic continuity. Like a Renaissance villa, his new courtyard assembles tableaus from multiple media, buildings, greenery, water, artworks, and people, in a sequence of settings, external and internal, that feel like a personal exploration. Another important part of Verona's genius loci is the story of Dante. In 1313, exiled from Florence, the great poet fled to Verona as the guest of Can Grande della Scala, the great patron of the arts whose family later built the original castle. There, Dante completed his Divine Comedy, dedicating Paradiso to his host. He also wrote his famous letter to Can Grande to demonstrate how religious scripture's 4 levels of meaning could also apply to man-made creations like his own poetry. So he was very interested in how something could be interpreted at many different levels. Castle Vecchio's key artifact is the statue of Can Grande. It floats 14 meters above the ground, and the visitor's route, which is built, from pathways and sightlines, circulates around the night, seeing him from various partial viewpoints. Scarpa opened the space for the statue, because it's in the space between 2 parts of the site. By strategically separating existing buildings, he actually demolished a building bay and a staircase that Napoleon had built. And when he did this, he found a buried city gate. So remember I said earlier that it was built on the old walls. It used to be a very busy city gate in the 12th century called the Porta del Morbido. So when visitors walk this path that he kind of put through the old gate, they are reenacting the steps of Verona's medieval citizens, bringing to life people's daily stories by an architectural neorealism. So instead of one story dominating, Scarpa introduces the past's multiple voices. So, amongst which are the everyday people of Verona. You also walk symbolically in the shoes of Dante as the roving guest of Can Grande, who, here you see again, who you glimpse many times peripherally before coming face to face with him. Their stories anchored Can Grande and Dante to the site, and for Scarpa, they brought to life rich pre-modern models of space, architecture, and poetics. Castle Vecchio's medieval fabric, irregular and asymmetrical, prompted localized, anti-standardized design strategies. His modern idiom revived this pre-perspectival spatial depth. So everywhere you go, paving and floors have unevenly spaced banding and jointing, syncopated rhythms that stop you from being able to measure the space by eye, reinstating your sensory moving body as your guide. So these tactics forestall any kind of totalizing perspectival vision, which has been the Western model for seeing the world since the Renaissance. It goes back before to the medieval character of the site. So here the rooms will attune you to the medieval spatial sense of Can Grande's world, where intervals were not void. Your body's orientation in space has distinctive qualities such as left and right, behind and in front, above and below, and these qualities have symbolic meanings. They're deeply embedded in culture. Scarpa remains a modernist, and he never mimics the medieval forms like postmodernism. He uses the principles instead. So if you look down at the paving below the statue, you can see that the floor has no grid. Every stone is unique in its size, in its direction of grain, its color. And the effect is to enhance awareness of materiality with a mild dynamism. It reminds me a little bit of a Paul Klee painting or a work by Piet Mondrian. And Scarpa, in this way, eliminates abstract space. Each part is distinctive, it's a place, it has memory, and it's consolidated. So then he treats every architectural plane, whether it's the floors or the roof, as an artistic site. Under the surface of matter is more matter. There's more layers, like an onion. Under every stone surface lies another plane of stone, more stone. It's an inquiry into the simple elements that make architectural magic. Scarpa's neoplastic interest in planes includes a discourse about surfaces and what lies within solid matter when we look through a picture plane. So in the last sculpture gallery, Scarpa opens a picture window in the floor to offer a glimpse of the real's unknown depths. There is a horizon of vision here and architecture is the device that lets you see beyond. Um, if we want to think sort of conceptually, we can think about this early modern perspective painting, which is actually in the collection. A figurative painting dematerializes its wooden surface. So you look through it into another world, not at it. Whereas if you actually look at the gold painted architecture that you're looking at and not through, there's a kind of a distinction there. At Castle Vecchio, the other world is already metaphorically present in real space. So he emphasizes the materiality of the surface to keep our attention present, to kind of restore us physically to the space. And the same goes for non-illusionistic medieval frescoes. So, and in fact, here's just a little piece of trivia. If you look at the upper part of the wall, you can see dogs on a ladder. That's a rebus or a pictogram for can grande, meaning big dog, della scala, of the ladder or of the stair, which is a kind of corporeal language, which is quite common throughout Italy. So that's basically how people would make their family crests, with a pun that conjured up the name. Scarpa defamiliarizes elements, and we're going to talk more about that later, so that foreign objects interrupt your gaze, they deviate your flow of movement, and they grab your attention. And in doing this, he also takes cues from this pre-systematic architecture, especially the vernacular, the medieval, with its mysterious anomalies, its incongruous insertions, irregular pieces salvaged from other sites, and heterogeneous parts. The architecture very carefully calibrates your route. He modulates surfaces, he stage manages directional shifts, and this I find very interesting. By building narrow straits where one person alone may pass comfortably in single file, your underlying sense is the solitary encounter of pilgrimage. So from the first pedestrian bridge when you arrive to the river wall, which you can actually see at the upper right, um, the constrained stairs in the gap between buildings, like the ascent to this high catwalk, and in this photograph, and your descent around when you get really close to Can Grande, around his equestrian statue. You can descend a little bit, but for one person only. There are stepping stones for one, and the narrowed passage through the gate. Alone you stand undistracted in wonder, and alone you sit in the deep cut windows. So, like how modern artists approached materials, Scarpa adopted archaeological techniques to understand the site. So, like the idea of going under the surface to understand materiality. Archaeology allowed him to grasp material history. He began opening walls, digging, demolishing, separating historical layers, exposing strata. He excavated the old moats, which had once held water and then afterwards had been filled in with soil. So, Castle Vecchio offers you a sense of your place in the world by inventing a ground of meaning while always suggesting that something prior lies underneath and that there's always more to the story. With a kind of geological sensibility, he looks through the bounding surfaces of form into the depths of matter, where under every surface lies another surface. Also, the facades of the museum are compounded of layers that seem to be here rising and falling. So, amplifying this journey into the heart of matter is also seeing the building as this kind of chunk of material to be explored. And so thresholds will kind of telescope, solid elements will break into planes, walls pull apart and delaminate like layers of pastry so that you can enter into the space of these surfaces. And in the same vein, he created gaps or removals that emphasize the fragmentary quality of each piece. So he was basically doing this to enhance the formal qualities, the clarity, cutting these recessed linear spacings called reveals, which you probably know, to just give every element definition as an artifact, to give it kind of its own place, drawing attention to the different unique shades or texture or character, and then framing or separating or edging or banding with different strips of material. As an explorer of neoplastic art, in other words, dismantling conceptually, a master of bounding surfaces, edge, reveal, and joint, Scarpa was a connoisseur of the liminal. In Pilgrimage, as Dante himself observed, all becomes liminal. So, in elaborating Castelbacchio's itinerary, Scarpa materialized a key experience of Dante's literary pilgrimage to configure a poetic discourse about the museum, modernity, and the world beyond. In Castelbacchio's world of edges and boundaries, Can Grande's statue holds the center. It really is the only center, while the other ghost on site is his wandering guest, Dante. So, in the 1960s, the museum director published some important studies on the culture of medieval Verona and a book on Dante's Verona, and to accompany it, Scarpa designed an exhibition at Castle Vecchio. So Dante was really at the kind of center of their common research. And through these collaborations, they surely must have discussed Dante's most significant threshold, the earthly paradise on the summit of Mount Purgatory, which was the part of his cosmic poem that Dante wrote in Verona. Channeling Dante as a guardian spirit, Scarpa used fragments of found narrative to introduce conceptual ideas by using metaphorical space to prepare the visitor. So I'm gonna take you through the narrative sequence of just the courtyard, where you see the star. You enter from the west, which was not the original entrance. Scarpa moved the entrance, both the entrance to the site and the entrance to the building, in order to make the most use of the courtyard as a space for exploration. So where you enter, it doesn't have a street facade. And so instead of that, he substitutes the horizontal journey to materialize ideas for the visitor to hold in their mind as a guide to interpreting the museum. And so just as the visitors become medieval townsfolk passing through Scarpa's reopened gate, which is not the entry gate, their journey through the courtyard reenacts Dante's passage up to the earthly paradise. The indirect, drawn-out arrival, which is laced with delays and digressions, of course, builds anticipation and paces the guests to hurry slowly. So the new pedestrian entrance is off of the extension of the main bridge, which is actually kind of a street that passes through the site. And visitors will cross over to the far corner where I've labeled the door. Turning off the extension of the bridge, a gate in the massive wall beckons you into Castelvecchio's green courtyard, once a military ground. You enter over the narrow footbridge and across the old moat, now waterless, a spatial echo of Dante's circles of hell. The male bolge, or trenches, he described in Inferno. Reproposing pre-modern spatial arts, Scarpa configures asymmetries and directs your path using a left-hand rule. So here as the bridge splits, steps split at right angles and the path forks, offering you a choice of two directions. As the vision of Can Grande floating high in the air reorients you with the preferred left turn linking to the route's next segment. On the other hand, I mean, if you didn't take the left turn, echoing Dante's first lines in the Inferno by a dreaming pilgrim lost in the moral universe, La diritta via eras marita, the straight path ahead is lost. Disorientation in a sea of gravel, past this submerged fragment of the medieval chapel San Martino, its ruined foundation, in time's decomposition of form into formless matter. Scarpa's simple metal rail guides you into the ceremonial route, bounded by evergreen hedges, like an Italian cemetery's typical processional lane of cypresses, to corporeally establish the theme of the afterlife. On axis, with a Renaissance portal ahead, as you stroll between these green walls of yew, the ground imperceptibly slopes upward, as if from depths behind you are rising out of the earth. Deadly yew, Taxus baccata, is sacred to the underworld goddess Hecate. Ovid, the Roman poet, had yew trees line a path sloping down to Hades, at whose entrance in a sacred grove of trees grew the golden bough, a living key to enter the realm of the dead. So the walkway forms a metaphorical space of mythic settings rich with associations. And realizing mythology's potential in trees, plants, and flowers to evoke the underworld's botanical language, clearly excited, Scarpa wrote its Latin name 3 times on this drawing, so I circled that in red. You can see how kind of overexcited he got when he realized he could put the underworld into the space. Virgil leads Dante upward, and in the last cantos of Purgatory, the pilgrim crosses an ancient forest and reaches the earthly paradise, a lush garden with 2 rivers. From the woods, Matilda takes Dante to 2 streams flowing from a single source. Dante's 2 rivers are Lethe, river of oblivion, a water that causes forgetting, and Eunoe, river of knowledge, the water of memory. In Castle Vecchio's courtyard, these 2 reused fountains set the stage for the pilgrim's final crossing. Through the waters of forgetting and memory, flanking your path to the museum, Scarpa introduces modernity's guiding metaphors, forgetting and memory. As he formulates a modern architecture, he re-examines what that means for the existing world of matter, stories, traditions, and of course, history is a big part of that. As the hedges disgorge you, rose bushes block the access, so you cannot continue into that doorway. So you turn left towards the museum entrance, following the pavement between these 2 fountains. Drawing your attention left again, the first fountain's stepping stone dares you to drink from a spout in the neck of this calf with 1 golden horn. The stone's shape and location, with only 1 possible positioning for your feet, makes you lean right, so only your left hand is free to drink. The jugular flow suggests a ceremonial sacrifice, some kind of archaic ritual. Now, if you look at the drawing, the stone isn't there yet, but if you flip over the drawing, on the verso side, Scarpa's sketch reveals again the moment of insight. Placing a stepping stone in the pool lets the visitor drink this water, embodying the cosmic drama, and most importantly, corporeally joining the visitor's body with the architecture through the economy of water circulation. Matilda, initiator into secrets, obliges the poet, barely conscious, to drink from Lethe, river of forgetfulness. After you drink, like Dante, your change is not outward but inward. The roses that block and reorient you prefigure the climax of Dante's heavenly vision in the image of a rose, and evoke the arrival of Beatrice asking Matilda to take the poets through the river of memory. Here, an ancient sundial in the foreground, lacking a gnomon, or a shadow, suggests eternity. And in fact, for Dante, the sun and the rose symbolize the creator and his creation. Following the walkway, this lined fountain fills a long pool whose lines stream toward the door. As you walk along the paved edge, the pool keeps its level as the datum, because of course water is always a datum. And the path starting lower rises up by about the thickness of your foot, like you're emerging from the stream of remembrance. Following this double transformation by water, the anamnesis, Dante can ascend to the celestial realm with Beatrice. This dramatic prologue of a walk prefaces your entry into the museum, the home of the goddesses of memory, the modern institution for the afterlife of cultural artifacts. During construction, workmen removing a previous terrazzo floor unearthed old threshold stones, and this is what you're seeing to either side, leaned them up against the wall, rotating them from horizontal to vertical. And Scarpa liked this effect, and he kept them, and of course there was only one, so he fabricated matching stones for the facing sides. This was consistent with the theme of reinterpreting physical objects to be reused in a new way, taking on different meanings or orientations in space. So you can actually think of the fountains, which are already being reused. Also, in late antique Rome, architectural spoils, or spolia, the Roman marbles that were salvaged and repurposed for Christian buildings, symbolized death and resurrection of the body, a spiritual renewal. Following the afterlife metaphor, Scarpa's approach liberates the collection's found objects from restrictive conventional meanings, the kind you find written on the museum's tag, so storytelling can remake history as an open-ended creative project. In 1965, Scarpa met Marcel Duchamp in Rome when he designed his ready-mades exhibition, an artistic manifesto about second looks, openly rereading everyday common objects. And this also recollects Dante's letter to Can Grande about multiple levels of interpretation of a thing, and also the Roman practice of reuse of building parts. And if you remember, in 1917, Duchamp rotated a urinal upside down and presented it as an artwork called Fountain. Within the courtyard, Scarpa borrowed a technique from medieval art to shape intimate places. So remember, the courtyard is huge, and he's kind of creating places within it. And the technique is to cluster things on background planes. So here you pass this low wall that expands the facade. It's a homage to Roman concrete. It's irregular layers revealing the duration and process of its making, marking your passage into one final liminal zone before the entrance. From this drama of concealing and revealing, on your left a space opens, defined by three symbolic artifacts in a paved area. All three are partial objects of sacred architecture. They're linked together by proximity, color palette, and material. Verona's local stone, called Pietra di Prun, quarried since the 13th century, which ranges in hue from a chalky shell to a deep coral. So that's all the same stone. Deposited in sedimentary layers filled with sea fossils 65 million years ago, when the Great Extinction ended the Cretaceous era. Scarpa's stratified plain evokes this quarry where, even since the Iron Age, locals have pried out its naturally separate slabs. Jutting out of the facade is Scarpa's Sacellum, which is a Roman typology of an open-air roofless shrine. And this one, of course, has a plate glass roof because it's an interior. The antique sarcophagus, which in garden history represents the hereafter, the afterlife, and a triumph over death. And at eye level, a polychrome sun, a medieval medallion from the church floor of Santa Anastasia, so it also went like that, made by the same craftsman who carved Can Grande's statue. Scarpa's desire that the pattern for the stone cladding be non-repeating suggests how continuity involves evolutionary processes of reinvention. And I think it also raises some questions about entropy and higher order, a story for another day. These symbols of eternal life interpret this regional limestone in spiritual artifacts of three eras to stake out Verona's history via ancient Rome, the Middle Ages, and modernity, and indicating the cyclical nature of time because the modern invention reinterprets an ancient typology. So representation renews artifacts in their afterlife. In this secluded area, when you look down, the concrete stratifications juxtaposed with this huge ammonite fossil, sort of almost in the middle, you can see this, present the architecture as section and plan of the earth, our primary reference, attesting the limestone's geological age and Verona's sea change over millennia. Through this deep ecology view, we may consider the shell's spiral, ancient symbol of time, life, and growth, as signaling adaptive change towards the future. The sun marks your entrance into paradise. When Dante wrote Inferno and Purgatorio, he invoked memory's daughters, the Muses, to confer the knowledge of the cosmic laws. But for Paradiso, he needed both peaks of Parnassus, and the poet called on Apollo, the sun, which is fitting since the substance of the heavenly spheres is light. At Scarpa's new corner entrance, a plaster wall bisects the deep opening, and naturally you pass to its left as the L shape funnels you into the reception. So finally, with spiritual lucidity, you may enter the building as Dante entered paradise as a poet. His slow organic assemblage repurposed the collection's artifacts by enrolling stagecraft and montage to strip things of their separateness, including you, and tell stories. As you finally enter the sculpture galleries, you commence a poetic journey into the afterlife, like Aeneas grasping the golden bough to visit his father in the world beyond. So the architectural interventions here structure the time of your experience as a journey through the historical evidence of fragments that connect back into their larger hidden world, but he never fixes a meaning. The architecture leaves enough white space for interpreting, embracing poetic ambiguity, so that, as Freud wrote about dream interpretation, to connect the powerful iconic images, you have to fill in the gaps. Castelbacchio's discourse is not limited to verbal theory and shows how the language of modern architecture can physically convey philosophical ideas and support the experience of meaning. His design records how he configured the visitor's experience, not just at a sensuous level, but also intellectually, all integrated by the embodied imagination into a holistic poetic understanding. Since architecture knots together the full spectrum of experience, from the conceptual to the tactile, from prima materia to figurative form, the mythic configurations introduced through the narrative fragments coalesces the experience of meaning. So also by reevaluating the museum program, not to remain a container for precious objects, but a mechanism of modernity and an index of time, it demonstrates how we can continuously reread history. So the architecture is not an allegory because you don't need to know Dante to appreciate the museum, and the courtyard in any case only brings to life a fragment of his poem, and the root is actually ceremonial rather than allegorical or even picturesque. But to cite Dante in the architecture is to affirm the primacy of poetic authority and cosmic meaning. Scarpa created stories, histories, micro-narratives, because like Dante, he loved to read. And like Dante, he reads our world on multiple levels at once. But your body participates in the archetypes with which to grasp the building, the museum, the city, the artifacts, the dialectics of forgetting and remembering, poetry and history, modernity and antiquity, fragment and wholeness, knowledge and life. In this vein, Scarpa shifted the question of history beyond typology, beyond chronology, to explore how events or acts register on a site, physically or metaphysically, the way that living leaves scars on the body as cities metabolize and archaic memories resurface. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Yes, very much. Can you please stop sharing your screen so we can see you again?
There we go.
So thank you so much for this wonderful, beautiful presentation, Tracey. So many deep thoughts and also such depth of connection between all these different topics that we can relate, of course, to corporeality, and that we can see in the work of Carlo Scarpa. Specifically very important for this seminar and many of the topics we are dealing with, and also the exercise our students have to do, these ideas of defamiliarization, and also these references, for example, from Arte Povera, and how we can see how this wonderful way that Carlo Scarpa had of integrating the old with the new, and a very idiosyncratic approach to modernity. In the way he built. So you started exactly with this comparison with Le Corbusier and the Promenade Architecturale, this much more programmed and fixed idea of how we can approach a building with our body. And then we have here Carlo Scarpa much more open invitations to how we approach how we can approach his buildings, but equally thoughtful and equally precise in its own way. So thank you so much for really sharing all. I could have so many memories also from my home country, from Portugal, and all these textures, all these wonderful images that came to mind, looking also at a building exactly as an example of the passage of time. Also, not just this idea of the ruin as something that we somehow live abandoned or neglected, but also something building and fragments of building and fragments of time as something that we can treasure and that we can learn from. So that's also something that I found very, very important in your presentation, specifically with this topic of corporeality. And we are working for the seminar with this text from E.M. Forster, The Machine Stops. And it's this kind of dystopian vision of a future where we are doing everything the machine tells us. And this feels oddly familiar. And it's so important to see through your presentation the work of Carlo Scarpa, and how architecture is not just about meeting requirements and following programs and having very precise ideas of where things go, which is something that the digital is definitely enhancing, this compartmentalization and organization of everything of the everyday, more and more efficient. And we have here a great example of how the built environment really should invite us to this kind of engagement, multisensorial engagement. Also keeping us alert with these tricky steps that are gentle, but at the same time always invite us to be alert to our surroundings, mind where we place our feet, and really engage so physically with this with the building, with these buildings and the exteriors. I wanted to ask you as a first question. I know that you lived and that you were teaching in Italy for a long time. But what was your first encounter with Carlo Scarpa, and how did you fall in love with his work, which is something that we definitely can feel through your presentation?
Yeah, so my actual first encounter with him was when I was a student. I was taken to Castle Vecchio and to the Brion Memorial as well. And as a student, the experience, the kind of physical experience that you have there is extraordinary. But you don't really have tools to decode it. In a way, what I was looking for when I went back there, you know, and I've been like, so now I've been back like 20, 30 times because I took students for many, many years. And then after that, in recent past, I've just, whenever I have an opportunity or I can go from Venice on a train, I will just go and, um, and kind of walk around on site. And I rejected all the sort of, you know, the stories that people tell about Scarpa are that, oh, you know, he's like, he does all these really expensive details. Or it's something very dreamlike, like, you know, he does a percorso that's all about light. And it's like, it's true in a way. I mean, it's true that he does this beautiful narrative space that um, has a sequence where the light is very prominent. But I thought, um, I want to understand really like what was he after? What was he after? How was he thinking? Because I think it's a great privilege to have a glimpse into the mind of a great architect and to understand, you know, the kind of context of their, um, well, the context they're working in. Which for Scarpa, I think it's really interesting. There's different levels. One is he goes deep into like a kind of critical regionalism. He gets also very deep into art and art history. That's unfolding around him. So he not only looks at the medieval painters, but he also begins to put on exhibitions himself. In fact, so Scarpa and Magagnato, while they were building Castle Vecchio over a very long period of time, were also together and separately making these art exhibitions. You know, Scarpa, you know, and they were not always on site. Sometimes it would be at the Biennale, but you know, he was looking at Paul Klee, he was looking at Piet Mondrian. They were both looking at Dante. They were looking at painters who were contemporary of the medieval site, so Pisanello, Altichiero, and um, so partly, you know, they're like influences, and partly they're also helping to build an artistic strategy, of course, and then the whole other sort of set of influences coming, well, and probably going in both directions from Bruno Zevi, who was very much a critical theorist. But that's, again, it's kind of a conversation for another day. And so I would walk around on site kind of looking for clues. And, you know, because the first way that everybody understands that site is physically. And that's partly also why this is an interesting narrative for architects, but people don't need to know that they are reenacting a cosmic drama. Um, they don't need to find that out. Some people could find that out. I found that out. Um, but most visitors feel the experience of reenacting the cosmic drama because of the way that the, like, if I can call it a montage, because of the way that the spatial sequence is created, that it has these certain spatial conditions that, including, which I think is very fun, the drink from the fountain. Um, and you know, not everybody does those, but there's a kind of a sense that your body conveys to you that doesn't have to pass through the intellectual level. And I think I was really interested in that. Like, I'm interested in like how those different levels are kind of working together, or you know, sort of coalescing as I was describing.
Yes, I understand what you mean very well, because I think that one can really feel that this dimension also almost of ritual that we can do it more or less thoughtfully, can be something that is given as an offering through the building, that you don't have to know precisely what you're doing, but you can allow yourself to go through this experience and be equally changed. Even if not immediately, there's of course some transformation that happens because you constantly have to adjust to the experience and somehow surrender to this experience, which of course is very sensual and very, and obviously very moving. I also found it so moving, and here our students, they all kind of reacted in unison. You had this, one of these slides had these beautiful stones with a kind of a red smear. I don't know if it's rust. I think it's some metal from the stone that kind of smear. Sorry? Or iron, yes. And it looked, we all reacted. It was so gorgeous to see. And of course we can make this question. Of course, we know the whole legacy of the international style and how in so many architectural schools all over the world we still learn that the white wall and the white box, that this is still a paradigm that hasn't really changed. And then we see in comparison the beauty of working with of course these natural materials, but also of not following this compulsion of this neurosis of keeping everything looking new and looking fresh, but really accepting that the aging of the material and the whole process of seeing how the material reacts to the natural elements is something of a great beauty in itself, that brings so much richness also to how we can appreciate and deal with our environment. So thank you so much also for specifically bringing all these textures. It's a great addition also to the cycle. I think you were the first speaker who showed so many images with so much texture, and synesthetically we can already feel the differences in heat and also the smells and all of these that we can sense through your presentation. Now I would like to ask our students to come and bring their questions. Yes, there's already one on the way. We just need a little time. We have here this owl, our meeting owl, which allow us to be in this liminal state. This was also wonderful. You brought in your presentation. I will get back to it. So please go ahead.
Okay, so I would like to know, in your opinion, how water changes its meaning between the Brion Memorial and the Castelbacchio project. And apart from the Divina Commedia references, if you think that there are some similarities in the use of water between those two projects.
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about it. I will make the disclaimer that I'm not an expert on the Brion Memorial, but my understanding of the use of water there is that it's also a reference to passing over a river to the land of the dead. Now, we may find that other scholars will argue with that. It's a very cursory reading from a kind of an amateur. But I think that the use of water as a sacred element was very important to Carlo Scarpa. He was, he wasn't born in Venice, but he spent a lot of his life in Venice. The quality and the character of the water as a living, dynamic element that's always present and always takes the light in different ways was kind of enriched by a lot of mythological understandings of water. So, I don't know if you know the book by Ivan Illich, the H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, which essentially the question and should come up also for generations now is to not look at water as a kind of like a chemical formula, but to really understand its place culturally, because when people love water, they will save it in a way that they might not if it's just like a chemical formula. It's in so coming back to your question, so in Castle Vecchio, the way that he's using water is it's a little bit more limited. You don't really see it throughout. It's really just in those two fountains. I mean, of course, also in the washrooms, but it's really not celebrated in the same way. And so you actually see the water and it surrounds you because it's on either side of you. And, you know, if you believe my story about the two fountains being the two rivers in the earthly paradise, then there is an important thing that happens to you, like through your kind of suspension of disbelief, because it's a dramatization. I mean, you're enacting, or you know, you either are or you aren't. You may not believe it. You can also walk between the water and go to the door and just enjoy at a kind of phenomenological level, um, you know, the motion of the water as a sign of the kind of life of the building. Like what Maria was saying earlier, it's so important. Scarpa really looks at the building as something alive that has like different ages of its life, even the ones that go way back beyond the architecture, back into prehistory, you know, on this long timeline. The architecture of the Castle Vecchio is here. And then like way back there is, you know, the kind of extinctions and the of the dinosaurs, and then somewhere into the future. The water keeps flowing through all of this. It's a kind of a beacon of hope. If you believe, you can imagine that drinking the water of forgetfulness and then the water of knowledge or memory is a way of like reinterpreting the future, not remembering everything, but remembering enough to connect back to the traditions, remaking it in, you know, in a different context, in a different world with different, maybe different essential values. I don't know if that's really answering your question. It's kind of the best that I can do to just like make that maybe a little clearer about the role that water
Thank you very
plays.
much. Yeah, yes, of course. But because I was interested in general, because I know that Scarpa uses water pretty much in every project. So it was very interesting to know the meaning of in this specific project. So it just popped out in my mind. But thank you very much for your interpretation.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's a great question. And now also listening to you, Tracey, I had to think, because water is also something that we have in our, it's a large part of our bodies are made of water. So I think that this has also a lot to do with the whole reason why water is also something that is used in many transition or transmutation rituals in so many different traditions and mythologies, exactly as something that we very easily can incorporate and really relate to this sense of liminality, like you were also saying. Water
Yes,
as
because one you're drinking and the other one you're immersing, even if it's suggested, it's not actual. But those are both very fundamental rituals, practices you'll find across the world in different cultures.
Yes, even in the most profane situations. So in Germany, you could see it in the beer fest, where everybody goes together and goes into this really Dionysian feast of beer drinking, which is something that you have to kind of grow on it and then start to appreciate it in all its excess. But there's definitely also some element there of this ritualistic connection to water. I don't know if there's any more questions from you. No, I would just like to ask, because we had Rulu here in the audience, colleague who normally also makes some questions. Okay, he's not here. But of course, there are still many topics. Tracey, I also found it so interesting in your presentation that you brought this idea of liminality. So really this concept of these spaces of ambiguity and also of transition. And I think that we can also relate this to the idea of the imagination as something that we, of course, experience in an embodied way, because, of course, we have imagination because we live in this body. But really, this kind of transitional state of consciousness where we are experiencing it through matter, but somehow connecting to something immaterial. could you maybe go deeper into this idea, how you were connecting the topic of liminality to Scarpa's work?
Yeah, so liminality, for, I don't know if there's anybody in the audience who hasn't been looking at it, but liminality is essentially in a ritual where you go, you're sort of going from one place or condition to another place or condition. So if you imagine like maybe moving from one space in the temple to another space in the temple. But as you pass the threshold, it's as if everything kind of dissolves and is sort of up for grabs. There's no kind of solid stability of being anymore as you go from one form of being to another form of being. This is a kind of an Aristotelian idea that when I'm here, I'm not exactly the same as when I'm over here. And in that moment of dissolution, there's like danger and opportunity both together at one time. I think that what Scarpa does with all his allusions to liminality, including the kind of, the sort of what I'm calling the pilgrimage for one. I mean, there's lots of places you can be together, but in many bottlenecks also where you have to go alone. I think that he's drawing attention to your own potential to change, to be something other, to be something kind of potential, to kind of have a spiritual growth. And it's a bit ephemeral because liminality is like that. It's really hard to kind of pin it down. It's poetic ambiguity at its kind of height, in a way, in a spiritual sense. But I do believe that that walking through this sequence of spaces does allow you to become someone other in certain moments, or to at least glimpse it. And that's a bit hard to pin down, but that's really what I see. That's what the pilgrimage is about. You're not the same person at the end of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is kind of, it's long, it's drawn out, it's episodic. There's continuous encounters with the other, with otherness. That must be digested, and by the time you come back full circle, you've changed. You're back in the same place as where you started, but your experience has left residues and memories and maybe scars, or maybe kind of positive, and knowledge, all these things that kind of accumulate on us. And I think that that's a kind of liminality in religion is a very sort of like condensed and extreme version of that.
And this is a wonderful way to explain this idea of liminality. And I was also, it comes just perfect exactly now with our situation, because I also like to see these conversations with the digital and here in also now finally in the physical space simultaneously, as a kind of liminal space where, as you were saying, the contact with the other can bring opportunities for change. I will write you after this, because some years ago I actually did a performance exactly working with this topic of liminality, and I think you will enjoy seeing it. But that will definitely be another conversation. But exactly, I think that it's also so important that you mentioned, in connection with the work of Scarpa, how we can use building and this idea of designing a building that somehow gives us also opportunities to destabilize, to break the usual patterns we have of thinking, of using our bodies, and creating exactly such a state of consciousness on purpose to give us the chance to reevaluate how we usually deal with our surroundings or how we deal with other people, and opening exactly in this transitional space, opening possibilities for the new and possibilities for change. So also thank you so much for bringing this together with this wonderful and beautiful example of the work of Scarpa.
Thank you so much, Maria.
Would you like to make any more comments, or no? Okay, so we will finish our session for now because we are already here a little bit over time in the classroom. So thank you again, Tracey, for this wonderful and inspiring presentation. It was a great contribution to our class and also to the cycle. It's the last conversation from the third cycle, and I think it really rounds this session very well. Hopefully we will continue with one more. I'm already thinking about it, but I think I could not think about a better ending for this cycle. So thank you so much.
Thank you again. It's been a real pleasure. So I wish you all a good evening and a beautiful rest of the summer.
Thank you. Same to you, Tracey. So we will keep in touch. I will definitely write you again.
Absolutely. We'll keep in touch, Maria. Take care.
Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.